The waters swelled with terrifying speed over the banks of the Rio Grande, swallowing everything in its path as Willow Brooks clutched her two children to her chest, their small bodies trembling against her as the muddy current pulled at her skirts. Spring of 1879 had brought the heaviest rains Las Lunas, New Mexico had seen in decades, turning the normally peaceful river into a raging monster that devoured the land without mercy. Willow's lungs burned as she fought to keep her head above water. Her daughter Emma, barely 6, and son James, only 4, clung to her neck with a desperate strength born of terror. The wagon crossing that had seemed safe only moments ago was now gone, swept away in an instant when the flash flood came roaring downstream with no warning. "Hold tight," she gasped, spitting out muddy water as the current dragged them further from shore. "Mom has got you." But even as the words left her lips, Willow felt her strength beginning to fail. The sodden weight of her dress pulled her down, and the children's panicked grips made it nearly impossible to swim. The roar of the water drowned out her children's terrified cries as she struggled to keep them all afloat, knowing with growing desperation that she couldn't hold on much longer. A quarter-mile upstream, Blake Nicholson tightened the cinch on his saddle, his eyes narrowing as he studied the rising waters. The experienced cowboy had spent enough years in New Mexico territory to recognize the telltale signs of a flash flood. The thunderstorm that had passed through earlier had dropped a torrent of rain in the mountains, and now that deadly wall of water was surging through the valley. Blake had just completed a cattle drive from Texas to deliver a herd to a rancher outside Las Lunas, and was preparing to head into town for supplies before starting the journey home. His keen ears caught something carried on the wind, a sound that didn't belong to the rushing water or creaking cottonwoods. It was a human cry, desperate and faint. Without hesitation, he swung onto his horse, a powerful buckskin named Thunder. The stallion responded immediately to Blake's urging, galloping along the riverbank as Blake scanned the churning water. Then he saw them, a woman and 2 small children, being swept downstream, barely visible among the debris and foam. "Hold on," he shouted, though he knew they couldn't hear him over the roar of the water. Blake assessed the situation with the quick calculation of a man accustomed to making life or death decisions. The current was too powerful to ride directly into, but he could see a bend ahead where the river widened. If he could reach that point before they did, he might have a chance. Digging his heels into Thunder's flanks, Blake pushed the horse to a breakneck pace, racing parallel to the river. The buckskin responded magnificently, seeming to understand the urgency as they pounded along the muddy bank, dodging fallen branches and slippery patches. Willow was losing her battle with the river. Her arms ached unbearably from holding the children, and each time she went under, it took more effort to resurface. Emma and James were sobbing, their little faces pale with fear and cold. "Please, God," she prayed silently as she fought for another breath. Her late husband, Thomas, had died of pneumonia just 3 months ago, leaving her to make this journey alone. She couldn't bear the thought of her children dying this way, terrified and cold in her failing arms. Just as her strength was about to give out completely, Willow heard a splash nearby and felt something solid brush against her arm. Through water-blurred vision, she saw a man on horseback next to her, his face set with determination. "Give me the children," Blake called, leaning precariously from his saddle as Thunder fought to maintain footing in the shallower water near the bank. Willow hesitated for only a fraction of a second before survival instinct took over. "Take them," she gasped, lifting Emma toward him with trembling arms. Blake grasped the little girl firmly, settling her in front of him on the saddle where she clung to the horn with white knuckles. "Now the boy," he commanded, reaching out again. With the last of her strength, Willow pushed James toward the stranger's outstretched hand. As the weight left her arms, she felt a momentary relief before the current caught her fully, pulling her under. "No!" Blake shouted. Securing the boy with one arm, he plunged his other hand into the water, catching Willow's wrist just as she began to slip away. With tremendous effort, he pulled her toward the horse, her waterlogged dress making her impossibly heavy. Thunder snorted and fought against the current, sensing his rider's desperate need for stability. Blake's shoulders strained as he hauled Willow partially across his leg, maintaining an iron grip on both her and the small boy. "Hold onto the saddle," he ordered as they slowly made their way toward the bank, each step precarious as Thunder navigated the treacherous footing. When they finally reached solid ground, Blake dismounted with the children, then helped Willow down. She collapsed onto the muddy bank, coughing up river water, her entire body shaking with cold and exhaustion. Blake quickly assessed the situation. The woman was pale as death, her lips blue with cold, and the children weren't much better. They needed warmth and shelter immediately. "My camp's not far," he said, helping Willow to her feet. "Can you ride?" Willow nodded weakly, unable to speak through her chattering teeth. Blake lifted the children onto Thunder's back, then helped Willow up before mounting behind them all. It was a heavy load for the horse, but Thunder was strong, and the distance was mercifully short. Blake's camp was sheltered among a stand of cottonwoods, far enough from the river to be safe from the flood. A small tent was pitched beside a wagon, and the remains of a morning fire still smoldered beneath a coffee pot. He quickly dismounted and lifted the children down, then Willow, who could barely stand. Blake worked with efficient movements, building up the fire while Willow huddled with her children nearby. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said matter-of-factly, rummaging in his wagon. He pulled out several wool blankets and a spare shirt and pants. "These will be too big, but they're dry." Willow looked at him with uncertainty, clutching her children close. Understanding her hesitation, Blake nodded toward the tent. "You can change in there. I'll see to the little ones out here." Grateful for his sensitivity, Willow took the offered clothes and stumbled into the tent. Her fingers were numb with cold as she struggled out of her sodden dress, petticoats, and undergarments. The cowboy's shirt hung nearly to her knees, and she had to roll the pants several times at the waist and ankles, but the dry fabric was blessed relief against her chilled skin. When she emerged, Blake had wrapped each child in a blanket beside the now roaring fire. He was heating coffee and had set out jerky and hardtack. "Thank you," Willow said, her voice still unsteady. "You saved our lives." Blake nodded, his expression serious beneath the brim of his hat. "What were you doing trying to cross the river during spring runoff?" "We didn't know," she said, accepting a tin cup of hot coffee with trembling hands. "The crossing looked safe when we started. Our wagon." Her voice caught as she realized all their possessions were now lost to the river. "I'm Willow Brooks," she added after a moment. "These are my children, Emma and James." "Blake Nicholson," he replied simply. "Where were you headed?" "Las Lunas. I have a sister there." Willow pulled Emma closer as the little girl sniffled. "After my husband died, we couldn't keep the farm in Missouri. Mary wrote that I could join her and her husband." Blake's weather-beaten face softened slightly at this information. "Las Lunas is only about 7 miles from here. Once you're all warmed up and rested, I can take you there." Willow nodded gratefully, too exhausted to say more. The enormity of what had happened, how close they had come to drowning, was beginning to sink in. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at her children, now safely drinking warm milk that Blake had heated for them. "You're safe now," Blake said quietly, noticing her distress. "That's what matters." As dusk fell, Blake prepared a simple but hearty stew from his provisions. The children, recovered somewhat from their ordeal, watched him with curious eyes as he moved around the camp, with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to life in the wilderness. Emma, the more talkative of the two, finally broke the silence. "Are you a real cowboy, mister?" Blake glanced at her, the hint of a smile touching his usually stern face. "I reckon I am." "Do you have a gun?" James asked, his eyes wide. "James," Willow admonished softly, but Blake didn't seem to mind. "I do," he said, stirring the pot over the fire. "But a gun is a tool, not a toy. A cowboy uses it to protect his herd from wolves and such." "Did you ever shoot a bad guy?" James persisted, clearly fascinated. Blake's expression grew more serious. "A man should never be eager to harm another, no matter who they are. Remember that." Willow studied their rescuer as he spoke to her son. Blake Nicholson appeared to be in his early 30s, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of the sky just before a storm. His dark hair was overgrown, and several days' worth of beard shadowed his jaw. He moved with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin, yet there was a wariness about him that spoke of hard experiences. "How long have you been a cowboy, Mr. Nicholson?" Willow asked, partly to divert her son's line of questioning and partly out of genuine curiosity. "Since I was 14, he replied, ladling stew into tin plates. "Started as a drover in Texas after my pa died. Been moving cattle ever since." "And do you have a home somewhere?" She immediately regretted the personal question when she saw a shadow cross his face. "The trail's my home," Blake said after a moment. "Just finished delivering a herd to the Mac Entire Ranch west of Las Lunas. Was headed into town tomorrow before starting back to Texas." They ate in companionable silence after that, the only sounds being the crackling of the fire and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. The storm that had caused the flood was moving away, but its effects would linger in the swollen river for days. As night descended fully, Blake arranged the sleeping quarters. "You and the children take the tent," he said firmly when Willow began to protest. "I'll sleep in my bedroll by the fire." Too exhausted to argue, Willow gathered her children and retreated to the tent. Despite their harrowing experience, Emma and James fell asleep almost immediately, curled against her like puppies seeking warmth. Willow, however, remained awake, listening to the sounds of the night and the occasional movement of their rescuer outside. She thought about how close they had come to death, and how this stranger had risked his life without hesitation to save them. In Missouri, after Thomas died, there had been plenty of sympathy but little practical help. Yet this cowboy, who owed them nothing, had plunged into a raging river for 3 people he didn't even know outside. Blake leaned against his saddle, smoking a cigarette and watching the dying embers of the fire. He wasn't normally one to dwell on might-have-beens, but he couldn't help thinking about what would have happened if he'd been even a few minutes later in spotting that woman and her children in the river, Willow Brooks. The name suited her, somehow slender yet strong, like the tree she was named for. Blake had encountered plenty of pioneer women in his travels, but there was something about this one that stirred his interest. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity with which she handled their desperate situation, or the gentle way she spoke to her children despite her own obvious exhaustion and fear. Blake flicked away the remains of his cigarette and pulled his blanket closer. He had no business thinking such thoughts. Tomorrow he would deliver Mrs. Brooks and her children safely to Las Lunas, and that would be the end of it. He had a job waiting back in Texas, and she had a new life to build with her sister's family. Yet as he drifted off to sleep, Blake found himself hoping the trip to Las Lunas wouldn't pass too quickly. Morning brought clear skies, and the realization that Willow's shoes had been lost in the river. Blake, noting her predicament, rummaged through his supplies and produced a pair of moccasins. "They might be a bit big, but they'll do until we can get you proper shoes in town," he said, handing them to her. Willow accepted the footwear gratefully. "You seem prepared for everything, Mr. Nicholson." "Blake," he corrected her, "and out here being unprepared can get you killed." They broke camp efficiently, with Blake teaching James how to properly extinguish a campfire while Willow helped Emma fold the blankets. By mid-morning, they were ready to depart. The river had receded somewhat but was still dangerously high, confirming that they would need to take a longer route to Las Lunas. "We'll have to go around," Blake explained, studying the terrain. "Adds a few hours, but better than risking another crossing." The travel arrangements presented a challenge. Blake's horse could easily carry him and one child for the journey, but not all four of them for the entire distance to Las Lunas. They decided that Willow would ride Thunder with Emma, while Blake would walk alongside, carrying James on his shoulders when the boy tired. As they set out, Willow couldn't help but admire the way Blake interacted with her children. Despite his somewhat gruff manner, he answered Emma's endless questions patiently and engaged James in games to distract him from the long journey. It was clear that beneath his weathered exterior was a gentle heart. "Have you ever had a family of your own, Blake?" Willow asked during a brief rest stop, immediately regretting the personal question when she saw his expression change. "No," he replied after a pause. "Never stayed in one place long enough. Don't you get lonely on the trail?" Blake adjusted his hat, seemingly uncomfortable with the direction of their conversation. "A man gets used to his own company." They continued their journey, the sun climbing higher in the sky as they made their way through the New Mexico landscape. The territory's beauty was on full display, mesas rising in the distance, sagebrush dotting the plains, and the occasional bloom of wildflowers adding splashes of color to the earthen palette. By early afternoon, James was growing cranky with fatigue. Blake hoisted the boy onto his shoulders without complaint. "You must be tired yourself," Willow observed, noting how Blake had been walking for hours, now with the added weight of her son. "I've driven cattle across 3 states without more than a few hours' sleep," he replied with a hint of pride. "This is nothing." As they traveled, Blake pointed out various plants and animals to the children, sharing knowledge gained from years of life outdoors. He showed Emma how to identify which berries were safe to eat and taught James how to spot rabbit trails. Willow watched this exchange with growing appreciation, remembering how Thomas had always been too busy with the farm to spend such time with the children. "You're good with them," she said quietly when the children were distracted by a jackrabbit darting across their path. Blake seemed embarrassed by the compliment. "Kids are easier than most grown folks. They say what they mean and mean what they say." "Unlike adults?" Willow asked with a small smile. "In my experience." His voice held a note of past disappointment that made Willow wonder what or who had made this man so guarded. By late afternoon, the outskirts of Las Lunas came into view. The small town had grown significantly in recent years with the arrival of the railroad, but it was still modest compared to larger settlements. Adobe buildings lined the main street, and a church steeple rose prominently against the sky. "My sister's place should be on the north side of town," Willow said, consulting a letter she had kept safely tucked in her pocket. Miraculously, it had survived the river crossing, though the ink was badly smudged. Mary wrote that her husband works at the mercantile and they live behind it. Blake nodded, adjusting a now sleeping James on his shoulders. "We'll find it." As they entered the town proper, Willow became acutely aware of her appearance. She was still wearing Blake's oversized clothing, her hair was a tangled mess, and she had no possessions other than her children. What would Mary think? Would her sister even recognize her after 5 years? Blake sensed her unease. "You're alive," he said simply. "Everything else can be replaced." His words gave her courage as they made their way down the dusty main street, drawing curious glances from townspeople. They located the Mercantile without difficulty, a substantial building with Fairchild's General Store painted across the front. A bell jingled as they entered the shop. Behind the counter stood a portly man with mutton chop whiskers who looked up at their arrival. "Can I help you folks?" he asked, eyeing their bedraggled appearance with mild concern. "I'm looking for Mary Fairchild," Willow said. "I'm her sister, Willow Brooks." The man's eyes widened in recognition. "Good heavens! Mary's been worried sick about you. You were expected 2 days ago." He came around the counter, calling toward a back room. "Mary, come quick!" A moment later, a woman who strongly resembled Willow rushed into the shop. She stopped short at the sight of her sister in men's clothing, accompanied by a dusty cowboy carrying her sleeping nephew. "Willow, what on earth happened?" The floodgates opened then, and Willow found herself enveloped in her sister's embrace as she tearfully recounted their ordeal on the river and Blake's heroic rescue. Mary listened in horror, hugging Emma tightly while her husband, George, relieved Blake of the still sleeping James. "You saved my sister and her children," Mary said to Blake, her eyes shining with gratitude. "We are forever in your debt, Mr. Nicholson." Blake shifted uncomfortably under her heartfelt thanks. Anyone would have done the same. "But they didn't," Willow said softly. "You did." George insisted that Blake join them for dinner despite the cowboy's protests that he should be moving on. "Nonsense. It's the least we can do. Besides, you look like you could use a proper meal." And so Blake found himself seated at the Fairchilds' dining table that evening, cleaned up and more presentable after making use of the wash basin George had provided. Willow, now dressed in borrowed clothes from her sister, looked transformed. With her chestnut hair neatly arranged and the dirt of their journey washed away, her natural beauty was evident. Blake found himself stealing glances at her throughout the meal, admiring the way her green eyes caught the lamplight and how her rare smile transformed her face. He reminded himself sternly that such observations were pointless. Tomorrow, he would be on his way back to Texas, and this brief intersection of their lives would be over. The meal was lively, with Emma and James now recovered from their ordeal eagerly telling their aunt and uncle about their adventure with the real cowboy who had saved them. Mary and George listened with appropriate exclamations of awe, while Willow occasionally corrected the more fantastical elements of her children's tale. "So you're heading back to Texas tomorrow?" George asked Blake as they enjoyed coffee after the meal. "That's the plan," Blake confirmed. "Got work waiting for me at the Double R Ranch." "Shame you can't stay longer," George said. "Town's having a spring social on Saturday. Good opportunity to meet folks." "George," Mary chided gently, "I'm sure Mr. Nicholson has more important things to do than attend a local dance." Blake nodded, relieved by Mary's understanding. Social gatherings had never been his forte. He preferred the company of cattle and fellow cowboys to the complications of town life. As the evening drew to a close, Blake prepared to take his leave. He would spend the night at the livery stable with Thunder and depart at first light. The Fairchilds tried to persuade him to use their spare room, but Blake politely declined. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm used to rougher accommodations." When it came time for goodbyes, Emma and James clung to Blake's legs, reluctant to see their hero depart. "Will you come back and visit us, Mr. Blake?" Emma asked, her bottom lip quivering slightly. Blake knelt down to the children's level. "I can't promise that, little miss. Texas is a far piece from here." "But you saved us," James protested. "That makes you family." The simple logic of the child's statement caught Blake off guard. Family. It had been so long since he'd considered anyone family that the word felt foreign on his tongue. "You'll always be in our prayers, Mr. Nicholson," Willow said quietly as she gently pulled her children back. "I wish there was some way to repay you for what you've done." "No repayment necessary, Mrs. Brooks. I'm just glad I was there." Blake tipped his hat to her and the Fairchilds, then turned to leave. "Mr. Nicholson," Mary called after him, "if you should change your mind about the social, you'd be most welcome." Blake acknowledged her with a nod but made no promises as he stepped out into the cool evening air. He walked slowly toward the livery stable, trying to shake off the strange reluctance he felt to leave Las Lunas. It made no sense. He had been a drifter for most of his life, never staying in one place for long. Why should this time be any different? Yet as he settled into the hay beside Thunder, Blake found his thoughts returning to Willow Brooks and her children. There was something about them that had touched a part of him he thought long buried, a yearning for connection, for roots. It was foolish, he knew. A woman like Willow, recently widowed and with 2 young children to care for, had no place in her life for a rootless cowboy with nothing to offer but calloused hands and a wanderer's heart. Morning arrived with unwelcome clarity. Blake rose before dawn, tending to Thunder and preparing for the journey ahead. He had just finished saddling his horse when the livery stable door opened, revealing George Fairchild. "Thought I might catch you before you left," the shopkeeper said, approaching with a bundle in his arms. "Mary sent some provisions for your trip, just a few things from the store." "That's mighty kind, but not necessary," Blake protested. George waved away his objection. "Consider it a small token of our appreciation. Oh, and there's a letter in there too, from Willow." Blake's hand stilled on the saddle straps. "A letter? She asked me to give it to you. Said it was important." Curiosity getting the better of him, Blake accepted the bundle. The letter was sealed with a drop of wax, his name written in a neat, feminine hand on the outside. "Well, I won't keep you," George said, seeming to understand Blake's desire for privacy. "Safe travels, Mr. Nicholson. And remember, you're always welcome in Las Lunas." When George had gone, Blake broke the seal on the letter and unfolded the single sheet of paper. "Dear Mr. Nicholson," it began. "Words cannot adequately express the depth of my gratitude for what you did for me and my children. You risked your life without hesitation for 3 strangers, an act of courage and kindness that I shall never forget. I understand that you must return to your life in Texas, but I wanted you to know that should you ever find yourself in Las Lunas again, there will always be a place for you at our table. Emma and James have already declared you their hero, and I cannot disagree with their assessment. May God watch over you on your journey as you watched over us in our moment of greatest need. With deepest gratitude, Willow Brooks." Blake read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He finished preparing Thunder for the journey, his movements mechanical as his mind wrestled with an unexpected dilemma. The sensible course was clear head south to Texas, where a job and familiar routine awaited. Yet something kept him from mounting his horse. After several minutes of internal debate, Blake made a decision that surprised even himself. He would delay his departure by a few days, just long enough to ensure that the Brooks family was properly settled and to confirm that the flood hadn't damaged the bridges south of town. It was a practical choice, he told himself, not influenced by the memory of Willow's grateful smile or the children's pleas for him to stay. With his mind made up, Blake led Thunder back toward the Fairchild store, uncertain of his reception but strangely at peace with his decision. Willow was sweeping the front porch of the store when she spotted Blake approaching, leading his horse. Her heart gave an unexpected leap at the sight of him. "Mr. Nicholson," she said, setting aside the broom. "I thought you'd be well on your way to Texas by now." "Thought so too," he admitted, removing his hat. "But it occurred to me that the bridges south might be affected by the flood. Figured it made sense to wait a few days before setting out." Willow's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Very sensible of you." "George mentioned there might be work at the livery if I wanted to earn my keep while waiting," Blake continued, oddly flustered by her smile. "And I thought maybe I could help you and the children get settled." "That's very kind," Willow said, "though I wouldn't want to impose on you further." "It's no imposition," Blake assured her. "Besides, I promised James I'd teach him how to throw a lasso. Can't break a promise to a boy." The genuine warmth in her eyes made Blake glad he had stayed. "In that case, I know 2 children who will be overjoyed to see you at breakfast tomorrow." "Just the children?" The words slipped out before Blake could stop them. Willow's cheeks colored slightly. "Their mother might be pleased as well," she admitted softly. That evening, Blake moved his few possessions into a small room above the livery stable that the owner, Hank Miller, offered in exchange for help with the horses. It wasn't much, just a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chair, but it was the first private space Blake had called his own in years. True to his word, Blake began helping at the livery the next morning, but he spent his afternoons with Willow and the children. He taught James to throw a small lasso, helped Emma collect wildflowers for her aunt's table, and assisted Willow with various tasks around the Fairchilds' home. Through these shared activities, Blake and Willow gradually learned more about each other. He told her about growing up on a small ranch in Texas, losing his father to a rustler's bullet when he was 13, and taking to the trail the following year. She shared stories of her life in Missouri, her marriage to Thomas, a kind but serious man 15 years her senior, and her dreams of giving her children a better life than the hardscrabble existence they'd known on the failing farm. "Thomas was a good husband and father," Willow said one afternoon as they walked behind the children, who were chasing butterflies in a meadow near town. "But there wasn't much joy in him. Life was duty and work with little room for play." Blake watched James trying to show his sister how to use the small lasso he had made for the boy. "Children need play as much as they need food and shelter." "That's what I think too," Willow agreed, but it was hard to convince Thomas. "He grew up very poor and was always afraid we'd end up the same way if he relaxed his vigilance for even a moment." "And you? What are you afraid of?" Blake asked, surprising himself with the personal question. Willow considered this for a moment. "Failing my children, I suppose. Not being strong enough to give them the life they deserve. From what I've seen, you don't lack for strength, Mrs. Brooks." "Willow," she corrected him with a small smile. "After all we've been through, I think we can dispense with formalities." "Willow," Blake repeated, liking the way her name felt on his tongue. They walked in companionable silence for a while, watching the children's carefree play. Blake found himself imagining a different life, one where evenings like this were commonplace rather than an unexpected interlude in his solitary existence. It was a dangerous line of thinking. "What about you, Blake? What are you afraid of?" Willow's question pulled him from his reverie. He was tempted to deflect with a joke about ornery bulls or rattlesnakes, but something in her open expression invited honesty. "Staying in one place too long, I suppose, putting down roots only to have them torn up." "Is that why you keep moving? Fear of loss?" Her perception was unsettling. "Maybe, never really thought about it that way." Before Willow could respond, Emma came running up to them, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mama, Mr. Blake, look what I found." She proudly displayed a perfect blue jay feather. "That's a fine feather, Miss Emma," Blake said seriously. "A lady could make a handsome hat with that." Emma beamed at his approval. Can we stay out longer, please? Willow glanced at the setting sun. Just a little while. Aunt Mary will have supper ready soon. As the children ran off again, Blake found himself studying Willow's profile in the golden evening light. She had a quiet beauty that grew more apparent the longer he knew her, not the flashy allure of saloon girls or the practiced charm of town belles, but something deeper and more enduring. "Will you come to the social on Saturday?" Willow asked suddenly, not looking at him. The question caught Blake off guard. "I don't much care for dancing." "The children would love to have you there," she said. "And so would I," she added more quietly. Blake hesitated. The thought of a formal social with its expectations of proper behavior and small talk made him uncomfortable, but the idea of Willow dancing with other men made him even more so. "I suppose I could make an appearance," he conceded, "though I can't promise not to step on your toes if we dance." Willow's smile was worth any discomfort the social might bring. "I have sturdy feet, Mr. Nicholson." By the time Saturday arrived, Blake had nearly talked himself out of attending the social a dozen times. He had no proper clothes, limited experience with town gatherings, and a nagging sense that he was allowing himself to form attachments that would only lead to pain when he eventually departed for Texas. Yet when evening came, he found himself standing before the small mirror in his room above the livery, wearing a clean shirt borrowed from George and his least worn pair of trousers. He had trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair with water, making a more presentable appearance than he had in years. "You're a fool, Nicholson," he muttered to his reflection, "getting spruced up like a stallion at auction." Nevertheless, he made his way to the town hall where the social was being held. Lanterns illuminated the building from within, and the sounds of a fiddle and piano spilled out into the street. Blake hesitated at the entrance, momentarily overwhelmed by the press of people and noise. "Mr. Blake." A small hand tugged at his sleeve, and he looked down to see Emma in a pretty blue dress, her hair tied with matching ribbons. "You came. Mama said you might not because cowboys don't like parties, but I told her you would because you promised." "I didn't exactly promise," Blake corrected gently, but allowed himself to be pulled inside by the enthusiastic child. The town hall had been transformed with bunting and spring flowers. Tables laden with food lined one wall, while the center of the room had been cleared for dancing. At the far end, a fiddler and pianist provided lively music. Blake scanned the crowd, finally spotting Willow near the refreshment table, deep in conversation with another woman. She wore a simple dress of deep green that complemented her eyes, and her hair was arranged in a style more elaborate than he had yet seen. She looked, Blake thought, like she belonged in a much grander setting than a territorial town social. As if sensing his gaze, Willow looked up and saw him. A smile of genuine pleasure transformed her face, and she excused herself from her conversation to make her way toward him. "You came," she said, echoing her daughter's words but with a warmth that made Blake's collar feel suddenly tight. "Said I might," he replied, attempting nonchalance despite the rapid beating of his heart. "And you clean up very nicely, I must say." Blake felt his ears grow warm at the compliment. "George lent me the shirt, figured I should try not to embarrass you and the children." "You could never embarrass us, Blake. We're proud to know you." The simple sincerity of her statement left him momentarily speechless. Before he could formulate a response, James appeared at his mother's side, tugging at her skirt. "Mama, can I show Mr. Blake the cake?" "It's as big as Thunder's head," Blake laughed, grateful for the boy's timely intervention. "That I have to see." The evening progressed more pleasantly than Blake had anticipated. The townspeople were friendly, many approaching to thank him for rescuing Willow, and the children news traveled fast in small communities. He managed an awkward dance with Willow, concentrating so hard on not stepping on her feet that he barely registered the curious glances and knowing smiles directed their way. "You're doing fine," Willow assured him as they circled the floor. "For a man who claims not to dance, you're quite graceful." "Horses are better partners," Blake said wryly. "They let you know clear enough when you're doing something wrong." Willow laughed, the sound making something tighten pleasantly in Blake's chest. "Are you comparing me to a horse, Mr. Nicholson?" "No, madam," he said quickly. "That would be ungentlemanly. And you are nothing if not a gentleman." Blake thought of his rough life on the trail, the bar fights and cattle rustlers and long nights under the stars. "I don't know about that." "I do," Willow said simply. "A true gentleman is measured by his actions, not his circumstances. And yours speak volumes." The music ended, and Blake reluctantly released her. They were immediately surrounded by the children, eager to show Blake the various attractions of the social. He allowed himself to be led away, aware of Willow's gaze following him. Later in the evening, as Blake stood near an open window enjoying a moment of relative quiet, George Fairchild approached with 2 glasses of punch. "Enjoying yourself?" the shopkeeper asked, offering Blake one of the glasses. "More than I expected to," Blake admitted, accepting the drink. George nodded, his expression thoughtful as he watched the dancers. "My sister-in-law seems to have taken quite a shine to you." Blake tensed slightly. "Mrs. Brooks is a fine woman, that she is," George agreed. "She's had a hard time of it, losing Thomas and trying to keep those children fed on next to nothing. It nearly broke her, I think, though she'd never admit it." "She's strong," Blake said, his eyes finding Willow across the room where she was helping James with a plate of food. "Strong, yes, but everyone needs someone to lean on sometimes." George gave Blake a meaningful look. "Mary and I are happy to have them with us, of course, but Willow's always been independent. She won't want to rely on her sister's charity for long." Blake wasn't sure what George was getting at, but he felt compelled to defend Willow. "She'll find her way. Women like her always do." "No doubt," George agreed, "but the road might be less rocky with the right partner beside her." He clapped Blake on the shoulder. "Just something to think about. If you'll excuse me, I promised my wife a dance." As George walked away, Blake found himself considering the shopkeeper's words. Was he suggesting what Blake thought he was? The idea seemed preposterous. Blake had nothing to offer a woman like Willow, no home, no stability, just a life of hard work and constant movement. Yet as the evening wore on, Blake couldn't help but notice how often his gaze sought Willow in the crowd, how his spirits lifted when she smiled in his direction, how natural it felt to have Emma and James at his side, looking up to him with trust and affection. The social was winding down when Willow approached him again, children in tow. "It's past someone's bedtime," she said, nodding toward James, who was fighting to keep his eyes open. "I'm not tired," the boy protested, undermining his claim with a massive yawn. Blake chuckled. "Only the toughest cowboys can stay up all night, partner. Takes years of practice." James considered this with drowsy seriousness. "Will you teach me?" "Maybe when you're older," Blake said, ruffling the boy's hair. "For now, you'd better listen to your ma." Emma, who was holding onto Blake's hand, looked up at him with solemn eyes. "Are you coming home with us, Mr. Blake?" The innocent question carried weight far beyond the child's understanding. Blake glanced at Willow, whose cheeks had colored slightly. "Mr. Nicholson has his own place to stay, Emma," she said gently. "But he's family now," Emma insisted. "He saved us." Willow met Blake's gaze over her daughter's head. "Mr. Blake has been very kind to us, but he has his own life. Remember, he'll be going back to Texas soon." The reminder stung more than Blake expected. He had been in Las Lunas for nearly a week now, far longer than he had intended. The Double R Ranch would be wondering where he was, though he had sent word with a southbound rider that he'd been delayed. "Will you walk us home?" Willow asked, breaking into his thoughts. "Of course," Blake replied, offering his arm in a gesture that felt both foreign and right. The night air was cool as they made their way through the quiet streets, James half asleep in Blake's arms while Emma skipped ahead with a lantern borrowed from the social. Willow walked beside Blake, close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent of her hair. "Thank you for coming tonight," she said quietly. "It meant a lot to the children, and to me," she added after a slight hesitation. "It was my pleasure," Blake replied, surprised to find he meant it sincerely. "Been a long time since I attended anything like that." "And was it as terrible as you feared?" "Not terrible at all," he admitted. "Good food, good music, good company. Hard to complain about that." They reached the Fairchilds' home, and Blake carefully transferred the now sleeping James to Willow's arms at the door. Emma gave Blake a fierce hug around the legs before following her mother inside. "Good night, Blake," Willow said softly. "Thank you again." He tipped his hat to her. "Good night, Willow." As Blake walked back to the livery stable, his mind was a tumult of conflicting thoughts. The practical part of him knew he should leave Las Lunas tomorrow, return to the life he understood. Yet another part, a part that had been dormant for so long he had forgotten its existence, rebelled against the idea of leaving Willow and her children. George's words echoed in his mind. The road might be less rocky with the right partner beside her. Could Blake be that partner? Did he even want to be? The questions followed him into uneasy dreams. Morning brought no clarity. Blake rose with the sun, as was his habit, and went about his chores at the livery with mechanical efficiency, his mind elsewhere. He was mucking out a stall when Hank Miller approached, wiping his hands on a rag. "Got a telegram for you, Nicholson," the livery owner said, holding out a piece of paper. "Came in this morning." Blake took the telegram with a sense of foreboding. Few people knew where to find him, and messages rarely brought good news. The telegram was brief and to the point. "Nicholson, stop, need you back soonest. Stop Johnson, injured. Stop cattle moving north next week. Stop Hargrove." Hargrove was the foreman at the Double R, a fair but demanding boss who ran one of the largest cattle operations in Texas. If Johnson was injured, they would indeed need every experienced hand they could get for the drive north. "Bad news?" Hank asked, noticing Blake's expression. "Need to get back to Texas," Blake replied, folding the telegram and tucking it into his pocket. "Likely day after tomorrow," Hank nodded. "Shame. Folks around here have taken a shine to you, especially the Brooks woman and her youngsters." Blake made a non-committal sound, not wanting to discuss Willow with the livery owner. "I'll settle up with you tomorrow." As Blake finished his morning chores, he wrestled with how to break the news to Willow and the children. He had known from the start that his stay in Las Lunas was temporary, yet somehow the reality of leaving had become more difficult to face with each passing day. He found Willow at the general store, helping Mary with inventory. Emma and James were playing quietly in a corner with some wooden blocks, but they looked up with delight when Blake entered. "Mr. Blake." James abandoned his blocks and ran to the cowboy, wrapping his arms around Blake's legs. "Are you going to teach me to ride today? You promised." Blake placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his heart heavy. "Not today, partner. Got some business to tend to." He looked up at Willow. "Could I have a word, Mrs. Brooks?" Something in his tone must have alerted her, for Willow's expression grew serious. "Of course." She turned to her sister. "Mary, would you keep an eye on the children for a moment?" Outside on the store's porch, Blake removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "Got a telegram this morning. They need me back in Texas." Willow's face remained composed, though Blake thought he detected a flicker of disappointment in her eyes. "I see. When will you be leaving?" "Day after tomorrow, most likely. Need to make sure Thunder's well rested for the journey." Willow nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands. "The children will be disappointed. They've grown quite attached to you. And I to them," Blake admitted. The words "and to you" remained unspoken, though they hung in the air between them. "Well, we always knew you would be moving on," Willow said, her voice carefully controlled. "We're grateful for the time you've spent with us." The formality in her tone stung Blake more than he cared to admit. "Willow, you should come for dinner tomorrow night," she interrupted, as if afraid of what he might say. "A proper farewell. The children would like that." "I'd be honored," Blake said, replacing his hat. "Thank you." The rest of the day passed in a haze for Blake. He made preparations for his journey, purchasing supplies and having Thunder reshod at the blacksmith's. All the while, his mind circled around the knowledge that in 2 days' time he would likely never see Willow Brooks or her children again. The thought left a hollow feeling in his chest that no amount of practical reasoning could dispel. Yes, he had responsibilities in Texas. Yes, he had always been a drifter, never staying in one place for long. But something had changed in the days since he had pulled Willow and her children from the river. He had changed. That evening, alone in his room above the livery, Blake made a decision. Before he left Las Lunas, he would speak honestly to Willow about the feelings that had grown within him. Even if nothing came of it, he couldn't ride away without at least giving voice to the truth in his heart. The following day seemed to pass with cruel swiftness. Blake completed his preparations for departure and settled his account with Hank Miller, who expressed genuine regret at losing his temporary helper. "You ever want a permanent position, you let me know," the livery owner said, shaking Blake's hand. "Las Lunas is growing. Could use a man who knows horses like you do." Blake thanked him but made no promises. His future felt increasingly uncertain, balanced on the outcome of the conversation he planned to have with Willow. As evening approached, Blake cleaned up as best he could and made his way to the Fairchilds' home for his farewell dinner. He had purchased small gifts for the children, a carved wooden horse for James, and a pretty hair ribbon for Emma which he carried in his pocket. For Willow, he had agonized before selecting a simple silver brooch from the general store, an extravagance he could ill afford but couldn't resist. The Fairchilds greeted him warmly, and dinner was a bittersweet affair. James and Emma peppered Blake with questions about Texas and extracted numerous promises about letters and potential visits. Mary and George were gracious, expressing again their gratitude for Blake's heroism and their hope that his journey would be safe. Through it all, Willow was quietly attentive, making sure Blake's plate was filled and his coffee cup never empty. She joined in the conversation, laughed at his stories about life on the trail, but Blake sensed a reserve in her manner that hadn't been there before. After dinner, when the children had opened their gifts with exclamations of delight and been sent to prepare for bed, Blake found himself momentarily alone with Willow in the Fairchilds' small parlor. Mary and George had tactfully excused themselves to help the children, leaving the two adults in an awkward silence. "I have something for you as well," Blake said after a moment, reaching into his pocket for the small package containing the brooch. Willow looked surprised. "You didn't need to get me anything, Blake." "Wanted to," he insisted, pressing the package into her hand. "It's nothing fancy, but I thought of you when I saw it." Willow carefully unwrapped the brooch, her eyes widening slightly as she held it up to the lamplight. The silver caught the glow, reflecting it in warm patterns across her face. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Thank you." Willow, Blake began, then faltered, uncertain how to express the tumult of feelings within him. She looked at him expectantly, something vulnerable in her expression that gave him courage. "I know I'm leaving tomorrow," he continued, "and I have obligations in Texas. But these past days with you and the children, they've meant something to me, more than I expected." He took a deep breath. "I'm not a man of means. Got no home except my saddle, no prospects except the next cattle drive. But if you might consider—" Willow's eyes had grown suspiciously bright. "What are you saying, Blake?" "I'm saying I don't want to leave," he admitted, the words tumbling out now. "Or at least, I don't want to leave you. And Emma and James," he added quickly. "I know it's fast and probably foolish, but I've never met anyone like you, Willow Brooks." She was silent for so long that Blake began to regret his impulsive confession. Then, to his astonishment, Willow reached out and took his hand. "I don't want you to leave either," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The children adore you and I—" She hesitated, color rising in her cheeks. "I've come to care for you a great deal." Hope surged in Blake's chest. "Enough to consider a future together. I know it wouldn't be easy. I'd have to find steady work, somewhere we could put down roots." "You do that? Give up the trail?" Willow looked surprised. "I thought that was your life." "It was," Blake acknowledged. "But a man can change when he finds something worth changing for." Willow's fingers tightened around his. "I don't want you to regret it, to resent us for tying you down. The only thing I'd regret is riding away without finding out what might be between us." Blake drew her closer. "I'm not asking for promises, Willow, just a chance. Let me go to Texas, settle things properly, and come back. Then we can see where this leads." Tears spilled onto Willow's cheeks. "And if it leads nowhere, then at least we tried," Blake said gently. "But I don't think that's going to happen." "Do you?" Willow shook her head, a smile breaking through her tears. "No, I don't think that's going to happen at all." Blake reached out hesitantly, brushing a tear from her cheek. When she didn't pull away, he leaned down and kissed her softly. It was a gentle kiss, tender and questioning. And when Willow responded with equal tenderness, Blake felt as though something long broken within him had finally begun to heal. They broke apart at the sound of footsteps, and moments later Mary and George returned with the children, who insisted on one last story from Blake before they would go to bed. As he spun a tale about a brave horse and his loyal cowboy, Blake caught Willow's eye across the room. The look they shared held promise and possibility, a silent agreement to explore the unexpected path that had opened before them. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Blake stood outside the Fairchilds' home, Thunder saddled and loaded for the journey to Texas. The goodbyes had been tearful on the children's part, solemn on George and Mary's, and filled with unspoken emotion between Blake and Willow. 3 weeks, Blake promised, holding Willow's hands in his. A month at the most. Time to settle things properly and make sure Hargrove has a replacement lined up. "We'll be here," Willow assured him, the silver brooch gleaming at her collar. "The children and I will watch for you every day." Blake kissed her once more, uncaring of the audience. Then, with a final wave, he mounted Thunder and set off south, his heart lighter than it had been in years despite the temporary separation ahead. True to his word, Blake Nicholson returned to Las Lunas 26 days later. The children spotted him first, their excited shouts bringing Willow running to the porch of the Fairchilds' home. Blake barely had time to dismount before Emma and James were upon him, chattering excitedly about all he had missed. Willow hung back, her eyes shining as she watched the reunion. When Blake finally disentangled himself from the children and approached her, she stepped forward into his embrace without hesitation. "You came back," she whispered against his chest. "Said I would, didn't I?" Blake replied, breathing in the lavender scent of her hair. "Yes, but I—" Willow pulled back to look up at him. Part of me was afraid you'd change your mind, that the trail would call you back." Blake shook his head. "The only calling I heard was yours." He gestured toward Thunder, who stood patiently nearby. "Got something to show you." Curious, Willow followed as Blake led her to his saddlebags. From within, he pulled a folded document and handed it to her. "What's this?" she asked, unfolding the paper. "Deed to a small spread about 5 miles west of town," Blake explained. "Nothing fancy, just a cabin and a few acres. Previous owner was heading back east, got it for a fair price." Willow stared at the document, then at Blake, her expression a mixture of shock and joy. "You bought land here? Figured if I'm going to court a lady properly, I ought to have a place to call home." Blake's voice held a note of uncertainty. "That is, if you're still willing to see where this leads." Willow's answer was to throw her arms around his neck, the deed clutched in one hand. "Oh, Blake, of course I am." The courtship of Blake Nicholson and Willow Brooks became something of a local legend in Las Lunas. The cowboy, who had saved a widow and her children from certain death in the Rio Grande, returned to claim not just their gratitude but their hearts as well. The town watched with approval as Blake fixed up the small cabin, added a proper barn, and began raising horses, a business that soon earned a reputation for producing some of the finest mounts in the territory. Willow and the children remained with the Fairchilds during the courtship, but they spent many days at Blake's new ranch, helping with chores, learning to ride, and gradually creating a home from what had once been a stranger's abandoned cabin. 6 months to the day after Blake pulled Willow from the river, they were married in the Las Lunas church, with Emma as flower girl and James proudly bearing the rings. The entire town turned out for the celebration, many still marveling at how a near tragedy had blossomed into such happiness. "Do you ever miss it?" Willow asked that night as they sat on the porch of their cabin, the children asleep inside. "The trail, I mean." Blake considered the question, his arm around his new wife's shoulders. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Miss the open sky at night, the fellowship around the campfire." A shadow crossed Willow's face and Blake tightened his arm around her. "But not enough to go back," he assured her. "What I found here, what we've built together, means more than all those years of wandering." "I just want you to be happy," Willow said, resting her head against his shoulder. "I am happy," Blake replied, and the simple truth of it filled him with wonder. Happier than I ever thought possible. And he was. In the years that followed, Blake Nicholson, once a rootless drifter, became firmly planted in the soil of Las Lunas. His horse breeding business prospered, allowing him to expand their land and build a larger home for his growing family. Willow gave birth to a son they named Thomas Blake Nicholson the year after their marriage, and 2 years later welcomed twin girls, Sarah and Rebecca. Emma and James grew tall and strong under Blake's guidance, the boy developing into a fine horseman who eventually joined his stepfather in the family business. Emma, with her quick mind and determined spirit, went on to become the first female schoolteacher in Las Lunas, beloved by generations of children. On quiet evenings, Blake would often find himself on the porch, watching the sun set over the land he had come to love, surrounded by the family that had claimed his heart. And in those moments, he would remember a rain-swollen river, a desperate rescue, and the extraordinary twist of fate that had transformed a solitary cowboy into a husband, father, and pillar of the community. "Penny for your thoughts," Willow would say, joining him with gray beginning to streak her chestnut hair, her green eyes still bright with the same spirit that had captivated him all those years ago. And Blake would smile, taking her hand in his. "Just counting my blessings," he would reply. "And thinking how sometimes the real treasure isn't what you're searching for, but what finds you when you're not looking." For Blake Nicholson, who had once measured his life in miles traveled and cattle herded, the greatest journey had been the one that led him to stop, to save a drowning woman and her children, and in doing so, to save himself from a lifetime of solitude. The cowboy who feared putting down roots had found, against all odds, that with the right soil and tender care, those roots could grow deep and strong, nourishing a life richer than any he could have imagined on the lonesome trail.